addiction an externalized mechanism of reward that is confused for necessity, something unmovable and unquestionable, a routine dopamine hit that conditions in the Pavlovian circularity of reinforcement, and that then conditions my very understanding of necessity and truth and reality and compels me to act in a certain way.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come up. John Vervaeke's framework of relevance realization and salience landscaping. In the mind of the addict, your salience landscape is distorted, right? And what is relevant is that which is relevant to your addiction, to the servicing of your addiction. And so all of the other stuff in the world, the volume is turned down on that, and all of the stuff which feeds your addiction, the volume is turned up on all of that stuff. So it's profoundly distorting of one's perception of reality. And so one's ability to discern what is meaningful and truthful and right to do in that landscape becomes impossible.
The distortion of reality as something heightened or privileged by addiction. It could be just the system of prioritization, because priorities also distort realities, distort the volume that we put on things. Addiction is being linked to certain forms of behavior and quite useful. There is a correlation that's been made with behavior like gambling on the stock exchange and addiction and those physical rewards that one gets when engaged in certain behaviors. That means that even certain legitimized forms of distortion are incorporated into the system, like stock markets and stock exchange.
Yeah, Gabor Mate defines addiction as any behavior which provides solace or comfort, and which cannot be stopped even when one realizes it is having detrimental effects on one's life. And so he sees it as usually a response to trauma, right? It's a self-medicating or a self-palliating response to trauma, which then becomes a thing in and of itself to be serviced. So yeah, rooted often in healing, right? It's something which begins as self-healing and then gets away from you after that. And so the truth of the addiction actually changes over time, right? It starts off as a legitimate and functional, adaptive response to a circumstance in the environment, but then because the trauma is never dealt with and healed, the solution to it is held onto and becomes a trauma in and of itself kind of thing.
The detriment to one's life, what happens if it's a detriment to someone else's life that isn't in direct proximity? Going back to that idea of the gambling on the stock exchange, it may not actually have a detriment on my own life. It may be having a huge detriment to a lot of other people, but it has a dissociative element that allows it to then take place because the detriment isn't directly fed into my own seeing of the world. And so I incorporate that into a valid form of behavior, a reality that's acceptable to me.
the counter argument to that would be that it is actually detrimental to that individual's life. They just don't realize it, right? Because they're so trapped in their delusion. And so what it is actually doing is blocking them from having relationships with their family and their friends, and appreciating the world for what it is, and blah, 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 blah. So they, although they may not be immediately aware of and connected to the detriment, it is still doing that if it's an addiction. Yeah, the relationship between truth and addiction is a very interesting one, because truth is the way out of addiction, right? And addiction clouds one's ability to perceive truth. So they are inextricably linked in that sense.
This view of detriment to oneself as being something that is, because it affects the fabric of our understanding of social relationships, is fascinating, because it can't be sufficient to define addiction, because otherwise any antisocial behavior could be defined as addictive if it's become a pattern. Addiction, there needs to be a sort of strong compulsion that pushes you towards something. It's complicated, not sure about all of that. And then the link to truth, again, it's this notion of distortion and truth, and how much distortion actually equivalates some form of questioning our reality or being acceptable as a distortion.
Compulsion is definitely a part of it. Definitely a part of it. That inability to not engage in the behavior is definitely a part of it. And the dopamine hit is definitely a part, or some kind of internal reward, if not dopamine, but you know, the some kind of internal reward which is sought, definitely. But yeah, this link between truth and addiction feels really important, because, as I said before, the way out of addiction is facing up to the truth of it, right? Understanding and being able to speak the truth of it to other people. This is why programs like AA and support groups are so effective, because they're forums for that truth to be expressed.
So it's almost as if you have these constructed maps of our world, one of them which is fueled by the compulsion and the dopamine, or whichever reward system is in place, and the other which has some form of externally validated truth, and the two clashing. So how to distinguish between how big that difference has to be for it to be socially acceptable or not, for it to be detrimental or not. And that's where all the fine lines come in, of when someone actually believes that they have an addiction or not, is how much it affects the reading we have of the truth, how important this notion of the truth is becoming in relationship to this one that is maybe externally pacted and maybe more socially constructed.
But does socially valid, I like that phrase, socially validated truth. I like that a lot. Does that make it any more true though, just because it's socially validated? I mean, that's a trap as well, potentially, isn't it? So that accepting things as more true than your truth simply because more people believe it to be true, that doesn't feel quite right either. So yeah, yeah, this is a minefield now, right? Especially in the mind of the addict, because you can't trust your own perceptions of truth, and group truth isn't necessarily any better than individual truth. And so it's about finding individuals and groups that, yeah, it's trust, isn't it? It's back to trust, transparency, and trust. How do you develop trust when you're in the maelstrom of addiction? How on earth do you distinguish who can be trusted and who can't be? It's a mess.